Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks for coming here, to the audience in the room and online, for joining us tonight. As IFID Chair, it is my pleasure to moderate tonight IFID's second co-badge seminar entitled The Case for Disaster Resilient Housing, Why and How, delivered by Dr. Abbie Liel. Dr. Abbie is a professor of civil, environmental, and architectural engineering at the University of Colorado Boulder, USA. She earned undergraduate degrees in civil engineering and in public and international affairs at Princeton University. She completed her graduate studies at University College London and her PhD at Stanford University. Abbie's work focuses on the assessment of risk from earthquakes, hurricanes, flooding, and snow for buildings, especially housing, studying how design, policy, and building codes can be used to improve building safety and community resilience. She has been the recipient of the Shah Family Innovation Prize from the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute, and she is a fellow of the American Society of Civil Engineers and its Structural Engineering Institute. She is currently visiting the Disaster Engineering for Resilient Society, the RISC Lab at UCL, co-directed by Professor Carmine Galasso, Dr. Gemma Cremen, and Dr. Roberto Gentile. Tonight's presentation evolves around the topic of safe and disaster-resilient housing and their critical role to our way of life, prosperity, and sense of security, and to the fact that despite decades of advances in technologies for engineering resilient housing, houses still remain particularly vulnerable to damage from earthquakes and other hazards, and this loss of housing has long-term community impacts, affecting recovery, workforce availability, economic prosperity, and public health, and exacerbating existing housing difficulties. This talk will explore housing safety challenges in earthquake and multi-hazard environments, using probabilistic performance assessment to characterize safety. And now, without further ado, I will leave the stage to Professor Liel and invite you all online and here tonight to keep your questions to the end of the talk when there will be a Q&A session dedicated to that. Thanks.
Okay, so hopefully, anyone tell, can you see it online? Maybe I'll complain. Thank you all for coming. I'm so happy to be here. As Various mentioned, I was at UCL for 2 years, but 20 years ago now, and so I'm really happy to be back and see everybody here, how much it's changed, and how many exciting ideas and things there are going on. So I am going to talk today about disaster resilient housing, and so I want to start with this slide from the movie Encanto, if you know it. I have a 5-year-old daughter, so I have kind of a different worldview than I used to have. But I really like, I like the movie, but I also like the idea about housing that movie expresses. Like this house, and if you've seen the movie, is much more than a house. It's an expression of family, it's an expression of magical powers, all of their kind of sense of who they are and who they want to be is embodied in that house. And although my house at home is not so lovely or magical or bright colored, I think it's true for all of us, right? That our houses are much more than shelter. They are for sure shelter, but they are so many more things, right? So they are a place to work, even before COVID, lots of people had businesses in their homes, right? And now many of us work remotely. They are, in many societies, the primary form of assets, our primary investments. Americans spend on average $14,000 a year on their homes, which relative to the median household income of like 40-something thousand, that's actually a pretty big number, right? So we invest a lot in our homes, and we think that they say something about who we are, right? So what our house looks like is something about what we present to others too. And so I want to make the case to you to begin with that houses are structures, that they are very different from other structures. And then in engineering them, we should also engineer them differently because of these kind of special characteristics of housing. So housing is though pretty tricky to actually engineer and to think about, make housing more disaster resilient. So one reason housing is tricky to deal with is that a lot of it is built kind of outside formal design and construction processes. Okay, so in many parts of the world, housing is built by groups of friends, by families, gradually as resources become available. And even in parts of the world where housing is built by professional contractors, so like in the US, it's built by professional contractors, it still is much more likely to be done kind of by somebody who owes you a favor, by somebody who's maybe not an experienced builder, right? So the builders who do housing are a different group of builders than maybe who do a lot of our other parts of infrastructure. As a result, there's a lot of variation in what's built in terms of whether it's code compliant, how things are attached to other things. So there's a lot of variation in housing that we don't necessarily see to the same extent in other forms of infrastructure that are kind of more heavily regulated, and it's more similar from kind of case to case what those buildings might look like. There's also wide variation in material properties. So this is a hardware store in Puerto Rico, which I'm going to talk about Puerto Rico in this presentation, but there's lots of variation kind of what you can find, what you can build with. And so as a result, no two houses are the same really. And so in order to really think about disaster resilient housing globally or across a community, we have to be able to kind of deal with these uncertainties in what's there and how it's been built. Housing is also probably the least disaster resilient form of infrastructure, right? So we have lots of problems with infrastructure and disaster resilience, and housing is very problematic. Millions of people every year lose their houses and are displaced due to disasters, earthquake, climate related things, other things. So this is a picture again from Puerto Rico. The roof was lost in Hurricane Maria. I'm going to get to kind of a history of Puerto Rico in a second, but that was in 2017. The building was then red tagged. That's what the red X means in the early 2020 earthquake. So you can see, first of all, there's a recovery challenge here, right, where the roof had not been repaired at the time of the earthquake happened. This picture was taken in February 2020. And this home was vulnerable both to hurricanes and earthquakes. And so this is the problem we want to take on. Like, I think, this is not a good outcome for individuals, it's not a good outcome for the community. So what can we do about this very tricky problem of houses that do not perform well in earthquakes and other events? Okay, so the last thing I want to come back to the Encanto thing for a second is just that the real central thing about housing that we have to consider is people, right? Housing are houses for people who live there. They say something about us. They are a representation of who we are. You can either see this as a barrier, a challenge, right? People doing all kinds of crazy things, adding additions or whatever. How are we supposed to assess that? What are we supposed to do? Or you can see it as an opportunity, right? Is that these people who live in these houses are experts in their own homes. They have no desire for their home to not be disaster resilient. They have a set of knowledge and resources to bring to bear. We'll talk about what those resources might be. And so how can we bring engineering and those people and those priorities together to actually do something that's resilient housing? Okay. So I'm going to talk about disaster resilient housing. I'm going to start with the engineering side. Then I'm going to go to housing safety perceptions of those working in the construction industry. And then I'm going to compare the housing safety perceptions and the engineering assessments and see what that comparison can reveal about what we can do about making our houses safer. And then I'm going to talk about a training that we are kind of in the process of developing to work with those with builders. So just quickly to acknowledge that the work that I'm going to present is the work of a team involving multiple colleagues, a group of amazing students, undergraduate and graduate students, and we have been working all over the world. I'm going to present work today on Puerto Rico, but I'm really happy to share, happy to be the voice presenting the amazing work of all of these people. Okay, so Puerto Rico is an American island in the Caribbean. It is technically a territory, and what that means is it has a complicated relationship with the rest of the U.S. It was damaged by Hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017. Those two hurricanes, which occurred in quick succession in September, damaged more than 1 million houses, or about a third of the total houses on the island. Puerto Rico was also extremely damaged in Hurricane Fiona, which was it was in September of this year, right? So this is a hurricane-prone region, and so that's one of the pieces of important context for Puerto Rico. They also experienced in 2019 and 2020 their first major earthquake since 1918, and that damaged and destroyed over 10,000 houses. If your Caribbean geography is maybe not awesome, it's not that far from Haiti and other parts of other islands in the Caribbean that we know have a very high seismicity. Okay, so let's start with the engineering side of things. Actually, let me just go back for 1 second. So other context for Puerto Rico, the island has a lot of debt. There's a lot of complicated economic situations, employment. There's lots of people who are unemployed. There's a lot of out-migration to the mainland United States or permanent United States. And so all these things are kind of contributing together to challenges around housing and safe disaster resilience. So as I promised, I'm going to start with the engineering, and I'm going to start with reinforced concrete houses. So here is 3 pictures of reinforced concrete houses in Puerto Rico. They are mostly reinforced concrete frames with concrete blocks, usually built as inbuilt. They are 1 or 2 stories and typically built in such a way that they can be expanded upwards in the future. There's, this is 3 pictures that I took. It is easy to find pictures that look basically like this. The spacing between columns is pretty similar. Everybody uses concrete blocks from the same manufacturer. So even though there's a lot of variation, kind of what they look like, the kind of overall, it's not that much variation compared to house in terms of the engineering details. And of course, they're not really, engineered. They're built by community members usually, and they have kind of typical dimensions. Apologies for the American dimensions, but that's how we still build. So what we did is we created a list or a set of 50 archetype reinforced concrete houses. Okay, so the student who worked on this was Pauline Murray. She's now a postdoc at University of Alaska. So we created models of 50 different houses, and the variations in those, so we looked at cases that varied in terms of concrete strength. Right, this is an environment where there's a wheelbarrow of sand, and things are mixed by hand generally. So there's wide variation in concrete strength, and it's probably low. We looked at variation in how many reinforcing bars, the transverse reinforcement, the thickness of the slab. It's very common to put pipes in your columns, so that's what the cross section one is. We looked at the effect of rebar corrosion in a very salty environment, left exposed for a long time, and we also looked at the effect of retrofit. So for each of these, we created a nonlinear simulation model and used OpenSeas, and then we assessed the performance of these houses. To do the assessment, we did incremental dynamic analysis. So we have a set of ground motions. We scaled those ground motions up and up and up until something happened. And the primary metric I'm going to use today is a collapse fragility. So that's shown on the right here. So probability of collapse as a function of ground motion intensity. Okay, so one of our conclusions one of our findings was that these open ground story houses are the most vulnerable. So on the right is all of the collapse fragilities that we generated for all the cases we looked at. The ones that have this open ground story are orange. And those are the most vulnerable. And this is in fact completely consistent with damage in the earthquakes that from a couple years ago, in which we find that these buildings that have these kind of relatively spindly, not very well reinforced columns, and a kind of a rigid block on top saw quite a bit of damage. So the first thing is that these houses are going to present a particular challenge in an earthquake environment. Now, obviously, there's a reason that people build this way in Puerto Rico, partially to park your car underneath them, but partially because they have a fairly big flood risk. So we'll come back to that in a second. Like the solution cannot necessarily be to not build an open ground story, right? Because there's other good reasons why that building practice is happening. We also looked at retrofit strategies. So in this plot here, the orange case is the one that is not retrofit. And then we looked at two different types of retrofit strategies. So the green and the purple are cases where we jacketed those columns, we basically made them bigger and added more reinforcement. And then in the black and the pink are the cases where we put infill, some infill in the bottom. Now, concrete block infill is not great, as we'll get to in a second, but it does add some strength and stiffness, even if it's not engineered, that is not present in those relatively small columns. Remember, they're like 8 inches by 14 inches, so 8 inches is like this. You know, they're not. Those columns are not very big. So one of the things we showed is that indeed there are practical retrofit strategies or new design strategies that can actually significantly reduce the risk. So those collapse fragility curves are shifting to the right, so lower probabilities of collapse. Looking at the cases that have this concrete block masonry, we saw that this partial height infill case is by far the most vulnerable. This is really common in cases where people want kind of privacy, but also ventilation. So it's the top part is open. It creates a really short column and sheer critical columns. And again, in the earthquakes, as shown in the photo there, in 2020, we did see quite a bit of damage in this type of construction. We also looked at other cases where there's a window or a door. Those are not as those do not have the same kind of negative effect or the same extent as the partial height infill. We also looked at comparing confined masonry and infill. So in confined masonry, the blocks are placed first and the frame is built around those blocks, and the whole thing acts more as a unit. In infill case, which is the more common case in Puerto Rico, the frame and the blocks fight together, creating all kinds of nasty brittle failure modes in both the wall and the frame. So we do see an improvement in the confined case relative to the infill case. So again, this is starting to show some potential opportunities of ways that we could maybe think about having safer housing. Okay. We also found, this is going to be really obvious for the engineers in the audience, but I'm going to give you a reason for stating such thing obvious. So like more mass makes your earthquake problem worse, right? So in cases where your infrastructure is engineered, when you have more mass, you design something to be stronger, right? In cases where it is not engineered, more mass just means worse, okay? So what happens is that people who have put these hefty slabs, so people, some of the slabs are like 4 inches, third of a foot, some of them are as much as a foot deep. And there's a huge difference in what we think the performance of those is based on how deep they decide to make their floor slab. So we see these important differences in the kind of what people do at the second story in terms of the overall performance of their housing. Okay, so that's earthquakes. I'm going to take a journey now through hurricane risk for a second. So the most common roof type is a wood frame roof with metal panels in Puerto Rico. And that can be either on a wood frame house or on a concrete house. Okay, so either one. There are some cases of concrete houses with concrete roofs. We didn't look at those. So you see we have kind of truss systems and purlins and these panels. So we looked at the performance of these kind of roofs. Again, looked at a variety of different cases that represent the types of roofs that we saw when we were doing field work in Puerto Rico and based on our community partners' input. And the first thing we found is that indeed, the kind of typical construction is not performing very well, right? We know this from hurricanes or Maria, we know it from Hurricane Fiona, but in our analysis model also suggests in a Category 1 storm, a lot of these roofs are going to fail. Okay, so this is problematic, right? Given that there's frequent hurricanes in this part of the world. And so these houses are not prepared. I mean, not even talking about category 3, 4, 5, right? We're talking about there's potential for serious damage in even a category 1 store. So then we looked at how, actually, let me just go back 1 second. And the most predominant failure mode in the analysis and as observed is kind of the panel lifting off of the roof structure. So then we asked ourselves, well, what can you do to prevent that panel from lifting off? Well, you can put your nails or your fasteners closer together. You can use thicker panels, so the middle 2 are thicker panels. And you can also use a different type of fastener. All of those things improve the wind speed at which you get failure. So basically it takes a higher wind speed in order to get failure of those. But they also move the failure somewhere else in the structure. So that's what this black horizontal line is saying. So all of those are like, if nothing else is happening, you could get a 35% improvement just by changing your spacing to 6 inches. But in fact, that's going to create a failure somewhere else in the roof structure. So the true benefit is not as big as kind of what's shown on that y-axis. We also then looked at, so if you can prevent your panels from being lost, then what happens next? Well, what happens next is either the roof structure comes apart or the roof comes off the entire house. So it either fails at the connections between the roof, or it fails at the connections between the roof and the house and the kind of the rest of the house. And there we saw that hurricane straps can be very effective at preventing or basically increasing the wind speed at which that analysis becomes, which that failure becomes likely. And we looked at, in our analysis, we looked at hurricane straps both kind of within the truss structure and also between the truss structures and the walls and the effectiveness of both of those. Okay. But there's also a really important message here about systems thinking, which is going to come up when I talk about our survey and the perceptions of the people working in the construction industry. And so to illustrate this, I'm going to go take a journey to the Philippines just because I think this picture really nicely illustrates one of the challenges we have here, which is that the picture on the left is of a house built after Typhoon Yolanda. It was built by a major aid organization, which I'm not going to name. They built thousands of those. And they also were worried about roof panels being lost. So they made an awesome roof, right? The fasteners are close together. There's all these kind of, it's a hip shape rather than a gable shape. There's all these kind of extra layers securing the panels. So they made this awesome roof because they were worried about what happened in Typhoon Yolanda, and they were responding to that. Now, what happened in these pictures are from a hurricane in the same part of the Philippines that was in December around Christmas 2019. They were taken in January 2020. They didn't strengthen the walls. So a common form of housing construction in the Philippines is this like woven bamboo walls. So they made the roof so strong that it produced a failure in the walls. Now, I don't know about you, but would you rather lose one panel off your house or would you rather have the whole thing pancaked down? Right, so this is an example of a set of engineering judgments, or maybe non-engineering, but engineering, not entirely illogical engineering judgments that led to actually a much worse outcome for community members. And we saw, just in our field work, we saw probably 60 houses that looked like this, and we weren't being systematic. So I'm sure, like, we weren't trying to count them all. So I'm sure that there were. And the same, you can, returning now to Puerto Rico, this is a picture from the New York Times after Hurricane Fiona in September. Here is a case, again, of somebody who lost not a single panel, which is a problem, but not maybe as devastating as they lost. This guy was named Nelson, lost the entire roof off his house. So you have to be careful about over-strengthening one part because it can have implications other places. So that creates a challenge with how we think about how we're going to do building and improve disaster resilience. Okay, the last thing I want to point out is that there is a real kind of set of trade-offs between hurricane and earthquake performance and risk in places that have both. And one of the guys that we interviewed called this the dilemma of the tropics. He said, I can build my house like that, and it's great in a hurricane and terrible in an earthquake. I can build my house like this, and maybe I'm gonna have problems in one or the other. So two things we really focused on were the open ground stories, which are in part built to help with flooding concerns, and the fact that those are the most vulnerable in earthquakes. And then I talked about how heavy is bad in earthquakes, and right, but people have learned over annual hurricane seasons that heavy roofs perform better, right? And they do perform better in wind events. And so how, but then we have this kind of problem with they perform worse in earthquakes. Okay. So in parallel to those engineering assessments, we did a bunch of interviews, and then we used those interviews to create a survey that we administered to 350 people. All of them are people who either worked in the building construction industry directly or who work at hardware stores. And hardware stores are the primary source of building information for people who are building on their own. So they're either, so the people we interviewed or did survey were either people who are actually building stuff or people who are telling other people what to build. And we pretty much visited every hardware store on the island of Puerto Rico. So we asked some questions about, who they are, but then in terms of understanding their safety perceptions, we focused on disaster experience, construction experience, expected housing damage, mitigation measures, and unsafe construction practices. So I'm just going to show you a few of these results. So we asked, there are a lot of questions, we have a lot of results, but one of the things we found is that those who have more construction experience, like hands-on construction experience relative to those who are giving advice to the hardware store, had more nuanced perceptions of housing safety. So the people with construction experience are the kind of more blue color, and without are the black color. And you see that the people without had kind of a, let's call it a catastrophic view. They weren't that interested in cracking. They were like, it's all gone. The whole thing is collapsing. The whole, the column is collapsing. The wall is collapsing. The roof is collapsing. And people with construction experience had a somewhat more nuanced approach. This matters because thinking about what you're going to fix or what you're going to do differently next time, if you kind of have this all or nothing approach, it doesn't necessarily send you on the right track in terms of what you might do better next time. We also found that people have a lot of knowledge about what to do with hurricanes. So a lot of people talk to us about using tensioners on a roof. So there's a practice of basically putting cables on your roofs. They talked a lot about adding more nails and screws along the edges of the panel, right? I mean, that is much better, right? If you add those on the edge. They talked about using thicker panels. They talked about using thicker structural members. They also talked about hurricane straps. About 45% of our respondents talked about using hurricane straps for hurricanes. We also asked questions about what can you do about earthquakes, and what this plot says is that 50% of us said yes to everything. 50% of our respondents pretty much said that the answers we gave for earthquakes made sense, regardless of what we suggested. And this really speaks to a really fundamental uncertainty on how to handle earthquakes. They felt much more comfortable, much more experienced, much more knowledgeable about dealing with the hurricane problem, and much less certain about what to do about earthquakes. And people told us this too. They said, look, I would love to know what to do. I don't know what to do. And so what should I do to help her? We also asked, so we said, people are using unsafe construction practices. We asked them what unsafe construction practices do you see other people using? We asked for those. And then we asked them, for those unsafe construction practices that you've identified, what is the reason that people are using those unsafe construction? The important thing here is to compare the dark blue one and the light blue one. So the light blue one is financial constraints. That's I don't have enough money, or they don't have enough money to do the right thing or the safe thing. People did choose that option. But in most of the cases we looked at, and this is only some of the cases, some of the unsafe construction practices, in most of the cases, our respondents were more likely to choose technical construction. So this is starting to point at an opportunity. Yes, resources are limited in Puerto Rico. They are very limited. They are very limited other places in the world too, right? But in fact, a lot of the reasons that people are not doing these things is not, it's not entirely resource-based. So there's a place for information and for engineering here. So then what we did is we had the survey of 350 people telling us what they thought was bad in hurricanes and earthquakes. We had our engineering assessments telling us what engineering judgment thinks is bad in hurricanes and earthquakes. And then we identified places where those were not aligned. Okay, so what we did was we looked at places where, you know, the people participating said that practice is safe and we thought it was unsafe. Or cases where we thought it was really, really good and they only thought it was kind of good, right? So even cases like that, we could potentially identify as not aligned. And we only looked at those cases where the technical capacity was the primary variable. So we kind of took out the things that everybody said was resource limited. We didn't focus on those. We focused on things where there was a misalignment between engineering and the survey, and technical capacity was important. So here's some examples. Builders prioritize securing panels rather than roof connections. Okay, so we asked a question about expected damage in a future hurricane like Maria. You'll see that's on the bottom here. You'll see that most people said the panels will be torn off, and fewer people thought about that truss to wall connection or the purlin to truss failure. Even though we know, so we know in fact that some of these failures have occurred. And we also know that in our analysis, if we strengthen the panel too much, this happens, right? So not very many people worrying about that. We also asked about important mitigation measures for hurricanes, and only 45% of people chose hurricane straps. And instead they were talking about adding more nails and screws and things like this. And there are deeply held, really important reasons why people think this, right? So, you know, we have a lot of quotes, but because of my experience with Hurricane Georges as a kid, I learned that houses with zinc roofs are not safe. A lot of people thought it's better to stick with wood. So that's a reason for not using a hurricane strap because it's not wood. And then that's a comfort with a technology that exists and that they kind of know how to see. And 71% of people said that they just don't know how to use hurricane straps. 52% said there are financial constraints. So again, I don't want to minimize that there is a financial component here, and I'll talk about what that looks like in a second. But there is this important, like, we do not know what to do and how to build with hurricane straps. And yet on the other side, so our wind assessment showed that there's huge benefits of hurricane straps at 2 key locations. And I just want to mention that hurricane straps are widely available. They were available at every hardware store I went in. And so they're there, they're not that expensive. I'll talk about how expensive we think they are in a minute. And so there's an opportunity here to kind of see if we can bring these closer together, the survey and the engineering. We also identified a misalignment in that generally people are super freaked out about thin roofs. And because they have seen lighter materials blowing away like playing cards in hurricanes, but then, you know, the reaction to get, you know, to make a deeper and deeper and deeper roof slab, if you're not actually designing the rest of your house, or if there isn't like if you're not providing bigger columns and beams, actually creates a significant vulnerability in earthquake that would otherwise be present. The third misalignment was that we didn't see much distinction between confined masonry and infill among builders. So you can see at the top our pie chart, 56% of our respondents said the columns should be placed before the blocks, or that it doesn't matter. 44% said that the blocks should be placed before the columns. On this case, these opinions were very strongly held. So everyone who told us the answer to this question said, and I know I'm right because of, so widely varying, but strongly, deeply held opinions. And then one quote, so putting the blocks is a little harder than making the columns more convenient for the builder, but not for the client. And again, we see that only 52% of our respondents, I'm looking at the light gray, thought that a ring beam was important for an earthquake. We know, in fact, right, that that's an essential part of reinforced concrete construction that involves masonry, is having that beam along the top. Okay, and again, our seismic assessment showed that there's a lot of benefits from building with confined masonry. Okay, we also saw a lot of concern about open ground story houses, but but not a lot of clarity on how to address it. Okay, so this person is saying, before the earthquake, you knew you had to build tall stilts to avoid the seawater, but now it's also dangerous because if you don't take the right measures, they can crush down easily, and we don't know what those right measures are. So on this case, you know, there was an acknowledgement that this is risky or that we should be doing better, and a lack of clarity on how they could actually address it. And so again, we showed in our analysis that, you know, bigger columns with more reinforcement can in fact mitigate that. So you can have better earthquake performance and still have those tall stilts. So based on that, we collaboratively designed, piloted, and evaluated a capacity building approach focused on hurricane stress. So this is ongoing work that we have been working with community partners to design a training program that's like how to use hurricane straps correctly. And we studied our process of designing that training. So the listening, characterizing, designing, piloting, evaluating. We put some stuff together, we talked to some people, we changed it, we put some stuff together, and then we looked at how people's views of hurricane straps and how to use them were changing throughout that process. So the design process that we used was based on several principles. So first was collaboration with trusted local groups. This is pretty much only true, and especially in a situation like Puerto Rico, where there's a lot of concern about outsiders and their motivations and why they might be telling you to do a particular thing. So we worked with local groups who've been working with training builders and working on building and rebuilding after Hurricane Maria. We used a combination of PowerPoint lectures and demonstrations. So we built little model houses. And I guess one thing that I didn't focus on, but all of the interviews and everything were done in Spanish, and so the quotes I showed, for example, are translated from Spanish to English. So you know, we put together some slides. We also put together some little model houses. We asked people to try to pull them apart, and we focused everything on a discussion. So even when there was a PowerPoint, it was on a computer. We passed them, or handouts and passed them around. We talked about it, not like I'm doing right now. Me talking to you about what you should do. It was like, here's what you could do and what do you think about it? How could we learn from it? So just to illustrate this process. So during that, the people that we were talking to or training expressed their uncertainties and questions, and then we adjusted the training. So it kept changing in response to what was needed. And so I can give you an example of that, which is that we put together all this stuff about hurricane straps. Because it's really a pretty cheap, a pretty available, pretty effective technology. And we put together some slides. The first thing we learned, which we had learned in our survey, was that the typical hurricane strap that is available there has 4 places to put nails on the top and 4 places on the bottom. Was that in general people only use 2. Okay, so that's the first thing. We also found that they don't use nails, they use screws. So the technology is developed to be used with 4 nails at top and bottom. It is in fact generally being used with 2 screws at top and bottom. Well, so then why, right? What is the logic? So a couple different things. One thing is that they're nervous about wood, so putting more holes is perceived as being worse, right? So we heard that from several people. Like, why would I put more holes than I need? If I can secure it with 2, why would I put 4? There's also a preference for using screws, which I'll talk about in a second, related to building construction. So it's just easier to use screws. Now you can use screws, but you have to use specified screws. And in fact, usually they're using deck screws. Right, so, but they perceive that the major manufacturer, so Simpson Strong Tie is the major seller of hurricane straps in Puerto Rico. They do sell screws intended for hurricane strap use, but they're expensive, right? So people are mostly using deck screws, and they don't understand that the deck screw does not give you the same safety. So multiple people told us, well, we think Simpson's just trying to charge us more money for their screws, right? When in fact there is a difference between the screw that is being marketed for these in terms of its shear strength. So in response to learning all this and asking these questions, so wait, why are, because initially we're like 2 screws is more expensive than 4 nails. Like why are we doing this? So then we developed additional training materials on like, what is the difference between a screw and a nail? What is the difference between a specified screw and a conventional screw that you just find at the store? So based on that process, we worked with, around 20 trainers and builders and 3 different organizations. We looked at 2 different things. So we looked at self-efficacy, and that is the perceived ability to take action to change practices and mitigate risk. So in looking at how people respond to risk and whether they do something about it, self-efficacy is really important. And this is really the sense of, if I do something, does it matter? Me personally, Abby, can I do something to solve this problem? So we found some positive changes in self-efficacy. So we thought people were talking about, I could do this for $35, I can make sure my roof doesn't blow away. And this again is getting to the cost piece. This is only the materials, but the materials for hurricane straps are not that expensive. Even in a highly resource constrained environment, $35 relative to other expenses they're putting in their house is potentially manageable. The labor is trickier because they aren't that experienced with nails relative to screws. It's a common myth that hurricane straps are too expensive, but then also obstacles. It's going to take me 3 days to install hurricane straps with nails. It takes 1 day with screws, and it's more complicated than it needs to be. So that's self-efficacy. So that's what can I do something. We also looked at, do they believe that this technology works? Then we call that knowledge and mitigation measure efficacy. So can I do something? And if I have this technology available, is that a good thing to do? And do I have confidence that it works? And we also saw increases in whether people have confidence in hurricane straps as well. We asked them, we were being fairly professorial about it. So in the sense that like we looked at Bloom's taxonomy, which is a way of evaluating learning. And so we did some measurements of kind of, do they recall the information we presented or we talked about? And they also said like, well, what if your friend was building a house and you saw them using 2 screws? Like what would you say to them? And how would you help them? And so we looked at kind of various ways of evaluating learning. So I would start by explaining the screw versus a nail reacts differently to different stresses. It's a shear strength that you can bend like this, demonstrating what shear strength is. A screw will more likely crack under shear pressure. Okay, so we are still working on this. So we are furthering partnerships for more training. So the groups that we were working with were like, please like update what you have based on these conversations, send it back to us. We recently one of my PhD students recently went to Puerto Rico just a few weeks ago. We're developing partnerships with industry. So Simpson Strong, as I mentioned, is basically the primary place you get hurricane straps. We're working with their engineers and their local presence to try to engage them in helping people learn how to use their technology correctly. We're looking at the screw situation. So this is what's commonly used. Those don't work very well. We're also working on developing more guidance. So we are currently trying to do we're planning to do some tests and take some videos. This is like an Instagram goal of hurricane straps coming apart if you don't fasten them correctly, to really show why you need the 4 fasteners and why nails are better than screws with some visual evidence. We're looking at putting together a handbook. There is a lot of information. The problem is if you go to most hardware stores in Puerto Rico, it's a book about this big, this big, this thick, with like every product that has ever been sold. And in reality, there's only a few that a typical builder really needs. And so kind of distill that down to, how do you know, do you need choice 1, 2, or 3? And to use those effectively, because it's actually really overwhelming how many products they have and how difficult it is to distinguish between which is the appropriate one. We are also going to look at connections between the roof and the masonry. And we're gonna look at some other roof configurations that don't have trusses, that have more rafters. The other, I guess, the other industry partner is there's really only one lumberyard, or one major lumberyard. And so we're working on developing relationship with them too on the kind of wood and wood faster side. So concluding thoughts, I'm returning to Encanto. Housing is vulnerable, right? And we see this every time there's a disaster, but there are ways to improve performance, even of kind of this informally constructed housing. And you know, I talked about Puerto Rico today, and sometimes when I give this presentation to people who live in, or talk about this for people who live in the US or Western Europe or the UK, right? It's easy to think that this is not our problem because we don't build like this. We have built, like, I'm for Colorado, we have building codes or more effective building codes in the area. But I want to encourage you not to think about what your house is that distinct from these houses, right? The reality is that our regulatory processes, our design and construction for housing are widely variable. They are in many cases not as good as for other types of construction. So I think it's, so basically what I'm trying to say is it is a mistake to see this as like a global south problem. Like maybe in an extreme it is, but there's this kind of whole range of performance in housing, and we can really learn a lot about making our own houses safer from understanding kind of the challenges here. I also want to point out, I always get this question, these houses are almost certainly not code compliant. There are building codes in Puerto Rico, nobody really checks them. But if you were to retrofit the columns, for example, on those open ground stories, you probably cannot satisfy the code, but you can satisfy probably the intent of the code, which is protecting life safety, right? So just to think about, there's these complications around building codes and regulation and whether they're kind of getting in our way or helping us incentivize the right thing. And then the really important message of this talk is that the engineering is super revealing, but it's only revealing if we understand why the construction practice is happening, right? Because so the engineering can help us see this practice is worse than this one is very dangerous, and here are ways of addressing it. What it can't do is say, well, why do you build that way? Like people aren't random, they're not just doing whatever, right? They have a reason. And that reason is from their friends, that reason is their history. And so what what the survey and the interviews that we did are really doing is bringing that knowledge and that information along with the engineering to lead to safer housing, rather than allowing those to kind of conflict or fester in kind of separate silos where they don't ever talk to each other. And finally, I want to say that I don't want to say that resources are not a problem. They absolutely are a problem. If we had more resources, housing could be a lot safer. But in Puerto Rico, what we found is that it's not often the most critical barrier, and there's actually a lot that can be done with very small amounts of resources. And so it's how can we work on changing building practices in those areas where the resources are not the primary constraint. And with that, I'd be happy to take some questions. This work was supported by the U.S. National Science Foundation, University of Colorado. We also have a small amount of support from Simpson Strong-Tie, which we're excited about. And I'd be happy to take questions.
Whether there is any question from the audience. I think that you have a question, Karim.
Yeah, so Abbie, thanks a lot, very interesting talk. I'd like to ask about the survey you did to the people, when you asked them about the kind of measures that you need to implement to reduce the vulnerability against earthquakes or hurricanes, they seemed a bit expert. But then when they were trying to highlight the problem, they said that we don't have enough technical capacity. So in what sense? There are no enough expert engineers, there is no sufficient knowledge. So could you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I think, the people we talk to are experts in this sense, is that they have done building, they understand what people are buying and what they're doing. They have opinions about what other people are doing, right? And so the way we phrase those questions are like, what do you see other people doing that you're worried about? What do you think other people are doing that's unsafe? It's more difficult to get people to say what they're doing that might be unsafe, right? So we said kind of, well, what does Kareem do? That you would, so we asked the questions in that way. And the items that we asked them about were based on, so we asked about, there was a free entry, but then we also, from the interviews that we had done before, we also said like, do you think this practice is unsafe? So some of those are things that we suggested, like, what do you think about a ring beam? That was something that we put on the survey and then asked them what they thought about it. In terms of technical construction capacity, there are talented engineers and architects in Puerto Rico. Those resources are not generally available, right? Most communities do not have that expertise. And so this is really a locally driven building process with locally available, and so there is not generally access to like calculations. So we actually started this before the earthquakes in 2019, 2020. And before then, people were like, I don't need an engineer, I don't need an architect. And one of the things we saw when we talked to people after the earthquake is they were saying like, actually, we really would love to talk to an engineer. Could please find me one and bring them here so I can talk to them. And so there was one of the changes we noted kind of pre and post earthquake was a desire for that expertise, but it's not, there's a disconnect between where that expertise is and where the building is happening and such that it's not really generally available. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, you did. And also regarding the choice of retrofitting techniques to implement in your vulnerability models or fragility, you chose the jacketing in particular because it's the most common there, or because people said that this is what we.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So on the hurricane side, we chose things that people were already doing or wanted to do because there was more momentum there. On the earthquake side, people were like, what should we do? But there was an interest in making the columns bigger. And so, that's why we looked at that. There wasn't really an interest in adding infill at the bottom, but we thought, well, we'll check it and see how it affects things. So that was something that people were interested in, but nobody we talked to said they knew how to do it or like what they should do.
Okay, and were they specifically designed the jackets according to performance objectives, or just like?
No, we just made them. So in the same way that the houses are not designed, we added 4 inches or something to it, so something that seemed plausible as a way of being. So you could get even better performance, right, if you actually targeted something in particular. This was just like what would, some of these, smart resourceful people we've talked to, what are they likely to do? Well, they'll probably make it a little bigger and add a couple more bars, right? Like that's the ideas that people were floating.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Gemma?
Yeah, thanks, Abbie. That was very nice. Just wondering, with the answers to the survey, did you see any kind of systematic trends with underlying demographics? Like, were there spatial disparities? Anything to know?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we did look at those things. On demographics, no. We didn't we had more men than women, just by the nature of who we were talking to. But we didn't see trends across gender. We worked pretty hard. We thought we would see trends based on location, because one part of the island was much more heavily hit by Hurricane Maria, and the earthquakes were centered in kind of a different part of the island. What we eventually, and we didn't really see significant trends based on location. What we eventually determined was that on hurricanes, there's a lot of shared disaster experience and trauma, right? So even if your house wasn't damaged in Hurricane Maria, you definitely know people who were. And so there's just, even in the part of the island that were less affected, the next storm might have affected them, or, so on the hurricane side, it's just everybody has deep, long-term experience with hurricanes. On the earthquake side, my hypothesis, I can't prove this, but my hypothesis is so many people when we were there in February 2020 showed us, Facebook videos and stuff of people, and that because of how much the media covered those earthquakes and also social media, that again, like everybody was talking about concrete columns and stilts. Like, doesn't matter if they had a concrete house, not a concrete house, doesn't matter if they felt the earthquake or didn't feel the earthquake. And so as a result, I guess that we saw a fairly uniform, just we didn't see big spatial patterns. The other thing is that there have historically been differences in building practices across the island. So some parts of the island retained more wood frame construction for longer. But again, there's kind of enough of a shared culture around building that we didn't see that play out in our survey results. So the short answer is we looked at all the demographic stuff, but we didn't really find anything that was super interesting or revealing. Other than there's this like actually a lot of shared culture around building and disaster experience.
I have a question. Did you conduct any testing on I'm interested on the performance of roofs, especially. And did you conduct any tests on the performance of those roofs and whether like there are the so-called secondary modifiers, so the roof age, the condition, and all of that might have affected might have like resulted in what you've observed or exacerbated the current situation?
Yeah, we didn't do any experimental testing. One of the things we're currently doing is that Simpson Strong has done a lot of testing, and so we're bringing their test data into what we're doing, and we're trying to get them to test some things that are not well constructed. So they tend to test the well-constructed version of things. So we're also trying to get them to test some things that are not well constructed to kind of verify and validate some of those results. You know, what we find, you know, the assessment is fully probabilistic, and you know, we looked at different types of wood and different dimensions of lumber, and it changes the answer a little bit, but it doesn't really change kind of the bottom line, which is that many of these roofs are going to fail in a Category 1 storm or at high risk of failing Category 1 storm, and that like it is pretty easy to over strengthen the panels and lead to more catastrophic consequences. So like the numbers have certainly changed, and we have more precise information, but kind of the overall trends. Kind of every time we change something in the analysis model, I was like, oh, or tried another case, like maybe this is going to be different, and we ended up pretty much getting the same answer in broad strokes every time.
Thanks. So thank you for your talk. Arik and Maria also triggered more than 70,000 landslides. Have you ever looked at the risk of landslides? If so, do you know what is being done about houses in landslide-prone areas?
We didn't look at landslides. Another thing we didn't look at, which is relevant to this question, is a lot of houses are built in the mountains, are built on steep slopes in Puerto Rico, and that exacerbates these column situations because there's a lot of short, uneven length columns. There was one house we went to that was built on a steep, wet hillside that there were no footings under the columns. They just, you know, were placed in the soil. So I think there's definitely some issues around landslides and around housing built on hillsides that we didn't address in our study.
Any other question?
Can I just ask a quick question about the earthquakes? So is the island pretty uniformly seismically risky, or is it zoned? Did you find differences in people's perceptions of risk closer to known faults?
So it is not uniformly risky, but it's all pretty high seismic. So we use this like seismic design category A, B, C, D in the US, and D is the high one, and it's all of the island is in seismic design category D. One of the things that's actually going on right now, which is actually super exciting, is that the US Geological Survey is actually updating their hazard assessments for Puerto Rico, which hasn't been done in 20 years. And there's a lot of complications there because there's subduction and crustal events And so they're working in partnership with the Puerto Rico Geological Survey. And so I'm hopeful that we're gonna have better answers to that soon. So they're working on, they're working on that basically in 2028. And so I think we should have much better information about hazard going forward. But that said, I think kind of the general perception or like to somebody living in Puerto Rico, it all has essentially the same seismic. The feeling is that it all has the same seismic risk. And I don't really know when we do the more calculations how big of a difference it's going to be between like north and south, for example. It's not that big of an island, right? So it's.
Do you think people's perception of risk is to do with the return period of the event? So the hurricanes are obviously a lot more.
Yeah, so they're much more focused, quite logically, right? Much more focused on what they're going to do in the next hurricane than what they're going to do in the next earthquake.
Yeah.
And most people before, so we did some interviews before the earthquakes, and they were basically, why are you asking me about earthquakes? And then afterwards, we're much more interested to engage on that, because there's definitely a lot of fear around earthquakes and housing, earthquakes in schools. There were some very damaged schools. And so there's an interesting window of opportunity right now around earthquakes. So I mentioned an interest in engineers and architects, an interest in design details for these open ground story houses, an interest in really engaging and getting better hazard information. But it's like, there's so many challenges in Puerto Rico that I suspect that's not going to last too much longer, right? Something else is going to become very critical.
I just had a thought when we were talking about the roof ties and then the nails versus the screws. Have you ever had a discussion whether they could be sold as little packets together?
Yes, I would love it. That's what I'm gonna do if I ever start a company. No, it's like, but like, I guess, like, as someone who doesn't make hurricane straps for a living, I'm like, why do you sell 200 things? Sell 6 things. Sell 6 options. Tell them, provide pictures. In this case, use this one. In this case, and then package them. Like that's what I would do for that audience. There's also challenges in that. And this just gets to Puerto Rico's very complicated situation, right? Like, so most of the stuff that's sold in Puerto Rico, building products and others, is sold in English because it's part of the US. Whereas like there's a lot of materials about how to use hurricane straps in Spanish, but that's sold in Latin America, right? So there's all these other complications from the geopolitical situation where there's language barriers and all kinds of other things that we could also address. But yeah, I would love for things to be packaged together and sold as a kit. I think that would be really appealing.
No more questions? Seems not. So thanks again. And thanks to the people joining online as well. And have a good evening.